I'll be honest, I hate controversy. But unfortunately, running a channel that highlights the biographies of LGBT individuals, even a channel like mine that isn't all that successful by most standards, will attract some controversy. Never mind how careful I am with the sources, or that in some cases, like that video I did on Ruth and the video I did on Jesus, I'm talking about historical narratives and not actual human beings. So with that said, let's talk about a possibly bisexual king from the history of a country that made headlines in the West not too long ago because of an attempt to criminalize homosexuality. I'm sure this will go over smoothly with some people. Anyway, our story this month takes place in the Kingdom of Uganda. Founded around 1300 AD, the kingdom became a major power in East Central Africa by the 18th century, and at its peak stretched from the shores of Lake Victoria in the south to the River Nile in the north. The British would, as European colonizers often did, draw random borders on the map and just mix Uganda and its neighbors together to form the modern nation of Uganda. But the old borders of Baganda do match up with modern Uganda's central region. When he inherited the throne and the title of Kabaka, or king, from his father Mutisa at the age of 16 or 17 in October of 1884, Mwanga II found himself in charge of a tightly centralized and powerful state. Even then, though, there were quite a few threatening clouds on the horizon. Mutisa's reign had seen the increased presence of Muslim traders, as well as the arrival of Europeans. The Bagandans were well aware that these new visitors represented countries that had already helped themselves to large slices of Africa. And it wasn't just Europeans. Egypt also had plans to potentially annex Bugandan territory. Mutisa had all of this in mind when he wrote to Queen Victoria a letter delivered through the explorer Henry Morton Stanley. However, it is quite possible that Stanley might have, let's say, exercised some editorial judgment when he helped Mutisa write the letter in English. Instead of Mutisa's request to let his people trade for guns, Stanley made it sound like Mutisa was inviting the British to protect his kingdom. Then there were all the missionaries and their local converts. Essentially, there were three religious factions in Buganda by the time Mwanga came to the throne, and each of them had foreign strings attached. There were the Muslims, who sympathized with the nearby Sultanate of Zanzibar and with Egypt. Then there were the Catholics, who were usually French. And then there were the Protestants, most of whom were Anglicans from Britain. So it wasn't just about religion. In those days, religion potentially came with a side of foreign intervention, making matters more tense for anyone paranoid about Buganda's future independence is that the missionaries didn't target poor farmers or artisans. No, they took their Bibles and Quran straight to the kingdom's elites. Mwanga himself had, like any prince of the royal house, grown up among the pages. The pages were recruited among the sons of the ruling class, so they represented the kingdom's future elite, and Mwanga had seen firsthand how much their young minds were drawn to either Christianity or Islam. So he was already nervous from day one of his reign that basically the entire future generation of Buganda's movers and shakers had already been compromised by foreigners. So maybe we can find what the new Kabaka did to a certain poor Anglican bishop understandable. James Harrington had been named the first Anglican Archbishop of East Equatorial Africa. He was making a tour of his new spiritual territory and, against the advice of some people who knew the local politics better, decided to come to Buganda, taking a route from the east that the Bugandans had long associated with hostile foreign attacks. Rather than a nice, friendly meet and greet, Harrington was promptly killed under the direct orders of Mwanga. He would end up being just the first of what later generations would call the Uganda martyrs. According to the traditional account, Mwanga was in the habit of seducing the pages. along with sleeping with his 16 wives. His father supposedly had 87 though, so maybe Mwanga did have a preference. The lead page who had converted to Catholicism, Joseph Mukasa Balakudembe, protested against Mwanga's lustful antics and encouraged the other pages to do likewise. Mwanga had Joseph executed, but the poor young Catholic had already set a precedent. The other Christian pages continued in their usual duties, except pleasuring Mwanga. Eventually, Mwanga launched into a rage, and on June 3rd, 1886, had 31 of his pages burned alive in Namugongo, where executions for treason normally took place. Sporadic executions continued until, all in all, 23 Anglican and 22 Catholic converts were killed, along with a number of Muslims. And for some mysterious reason, the Christian sources don't bother to record how many of them were killed. In any case, both the Protestant and Catholic victims were commemorated as Uganda martyrs. In 1964, Pope Paul VI even made the Catholic Uganda martyrs saints. Now, this is the point in our story where I become a bit of a spoilsport. This tradition comes down to us through contemporary and later Christian sources. So while I do think there might have been something going on between Mwanga and his pages, it is possible the accusations against him were a gross distortion of what actually happened behind closed doors in the royal palace. It might not have been intentional propaganda, but a cultural misunderstanding. I know this sounds like the usual, well, there must be an explanation other than homosexual sexing that historians get up to. But I have to admit, scholars like Rahul, who specialize in sexuality studies and are definitely pro-LGBT, have made decent arguments about this. For example, as the scholar Sylvia Nannyonga-Tamusuza discusses, Bagandan culture had a custom where, within the confines of the royal palace, all members of the royal family, including the daughters of the Kabaka, were considered male, while commoners were gendered female. So maybe, just maybe, cultural differences like this caused the European missionaries to misinterpret relationships that may or may not have been sexual and or romantic. So, bottom line, we're not 100% sure of anything except it's complicated. But we can say that same-sex relations were at least partially accepted among the peoples of Uganda. For example, with some cultures around Uganda, there were people who were born male who were considered to belong to a third gender and were even allowed to marry other men. So it wouldn't have been outside the realm of possibility that a Kabaka having sexual relations with men would not have raised eyebrows. Or at least that would have been the case before all these white Christians started showing up. Honestly though, in a way, all of this is academic, since it's almost certain that the executions weren't just because, or even primarily because, Mwanga didn't like being put in the friend zone by his subordinates. Now hopefully this goes without saying, although given some of the comments I've gotten in the past, who the hell knows. It is my belief, in the official stance of this channel, that killing people for their beliefs is a bad thing. But that said, it has to be understood that Mwanga was acting out of legitimate fear. Britain really was after his kingdom. Now, the British, of course, like to think of themselves as being out on a civilizing mission in Africa and having a higher purpose. And in one of the great ironies that the history of colonization is full of, one of the lines used by British defenders of imperialism was that they had to take countries like Uganda in hand to protect them from the Arabic slave trade. But you don't have to do a lot of digging to find out that the British government's real motives were having bases in Africa to prevent other European powers from being able to mess with British shipping from and to India, as well as just taking over more resources. Baron Frederick Lugard, who was Britain's Governor-General of Nigeria and would play a big role in our story later on, wrote in his book, The Rise of Our East African Empire, "There are some who say we have no right to Africa at all, that it belongs to the natives. I hold that our right is the necessity that is upon us to provide for our ever-growing population. either by opening new fields of immigration or by providing work and employment, which the development of overseas expansion entails, and to stimulate trade by finding new markets, since we know what misery trade depression brings at home. So even if Mwanga did kill his pages out of personal rage, he had a real threat in mind as well. In fact, Mwanga's own actions help prove that all of this wasn't really about religion. He seems to have realized that he went too far and tried appointing young chiefs who had converted to Islam or Christianity to important political positions. Unfortunately, it was too little too late. On September 1888, a coalition of Christian and Muslim chiefs with British backing overthrew Mwanga and replaced him with his brother Kaiwewa. Immediately, though, the Muslims and Christians began brawling with each other. The Muslim faction got rid of Kaiwewa and replaced him with another member of the royal family who had converted to Islam and took the name Reid. The Anglican and Catholic factions then did the unthinkable and got into contact with Mwanga, who had gone into exile. Mwanga returned and led a military revolt that he rode back into power. By this point, though, there was no way he could reign without British blessing. Mwanga signed an agreement with the Imperial British East Africa Company, the IBEAC, a corporation which the British government gave the remit to oversee their operations in modern-day Uganda. The IBEAC, which was represented by Lord Lugard, signed an agreement with Mwanga. He had to relinquish some of the monarchy's traditional powers, and officially, the Kingdom of Baganda became a British protectorate. Still, at first, things went smoothly. With the help of British guns provided by the IBEAC, Mwanga expanded his kingdom's borders. However, he soon learned that the IBEAC was negotiating with the kingdom's top chiefs behind his back. So Mwanga went rogue and tried to lead another army of loyalists to drive the British out of Uganda. But by this point, the British fox was not just in the henhouse, but had drawn up and signed the lease. Mwanga's army was beaten, and the king fled into German East Africa. Since at this point Britain and Germany were still allies, Mwanga was detained. He escaped again and tried to raise another army in northern Uganda, but was once more captured and exiled to the Seychelles, a small archipelago nation in the Somali Sea. There, the former anti-Christian tyrant actually converted to Anglican Christianity and took the name Danieri, or Daniel. To be honest, I couldn't find out from my sources if the conversion was sincere or if it was a last-ditch attempt to get the British to restore him to his throne. Either way, he died there on May 8th, 1903, in his mid-30s. In the meantime, his infant son was crowned Daudi Chwa II, while the throne was really held by three leading chiefs, one Catholic and two Anglicans. In 1900, they signed a Uganda agreement with Baron Lugard, which made Buganda just a province of the British Protectorate of Uganda and split the land once controlled by the monarchy between the chiefs and the British government. So you could say that Mwanga's actions ended up only accelerating the British takeover of his kingdom. But after being abolished for a time in the late 20th century, the monarchy of Buganda exists today, even if its role nowadays is mostly ceremonial. So perhaps Mwanga had actually saved the monarchy's future. Still, Mwanga's legacy is extremely contested. Evangelicals in Uganda see him as a king who was introduced to homosexuality by Arab merchants, which is, not true. Meanwhile, gay rights activists in Uganda point to him as an example that homosexuality wasn't imported to Uganda, but was accepted, at least in certain socially prescribed ways, before European colonization. Instead, it was the Europeans who introduced anti-homosexuality attitudes and laws, which is what historical research actually suggests, and which has more or less happened again in recent years. And other Ugandans still hold him up as a symbol of African resistance to European colonizers. So, in a sense, even though Mwanga II's reign ended in defeat, he still left a mark on history that scholars will debate for generations to come.